Okay, I wanted to finish up the discussion of capitalism and democracy and say a few things about one of the readings in this last segment. So let me move on to this slide. So I think Merkel does a nice job of also highlighting the points I made for Bowles and Gintis. I used to have the students read an article by Bowles and Gintis that did touch on property rights and citizenship rights, but it was a long and excessively complex, dense piece. So I thought I would simply present it myself. And then I found Merkel's piece, which I think is quite good in touching on and highlighting some of the main issues related to this political economic issue. At one point, he says capitalism is not democratic. Should understand that based on property rights, and democracy is not capitalist. And again, we can think of that in the context of property rights and citizenship rights as one way to understand that statement. He also makes reference to varieties of capitalism and democracy. I think I might have made some reference to this earlier in the semester. I can't remember, but in my social change and international development class, we spend a week discussing the varieties of capitalism framework. The main point here is that capitalism as a system is not monolithic in the sense that there are wide varieties across capitalist regimes in terms of this kind of balance, if you like, between the primacy of property rights or I won't say the primacy, but certainly the role of citizenship rights and the balance between democracy and capitalism. So the United States, if we want to think about its form or type or variety of capitalism, I would describe as the most extreme form of neoliberal capitalism among major industrialized societies. I don't think there's any question about that. One of the measures of this would be the extent to which labor is decommodified. What that means, going back to what we discussed in part one, is the extent to which labor actually has some protections from the market and has the ability to receive a social wage or a citizen's wage, which allows workers, labor, to decide maybe not to enter the labor market if they can receive support over an extended period of time to meet their economic material needs. So if you just talk about the decommodification of labor, we have the least decommodification, or we might say in the United States, workers are more commodified than they are in other industrialized capitalist societies. When I talk about these other societies, we're talking about France, Italy, Sweden, Finland, Norway. There's Nordic forms of capitalism. There's Anglo forms of capitalism. There's communitarian forms. There's continental capitalism, Asian. So there's people have tried to break the capitalist nations of the world into these categories, and much of the basis on which they're placed into these categories involves the extent to which there is a significant role for government in intervening in the market, impeding, you might say, property rights or not. So we have the most predatory, extreme form of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, in the world among the major industrial societies. And this explains a lot of why the United States is an outlier on almost every measure of the socioeconomic quality of life. Market justice has prevailed over social justice to a much greater degree in the United States than in other countries. He makes reference to social welfare capitalism, the golden age of coexistence. And I just like to link some of the references and Merkel back to things we've discussed throughout this semester, this labor capital accord, this period from basically 1945 to the mid-1970s. That was the Keynesian New Deal period that we discussed. Now, there is an aspect of neoliberalism that Merkel highlights. It's very relevant for the United States, and it involves the financialization of the economy, which we've touched on briefly, and this idea of shareholder value. And it's really important for you to understand this principle of shareholder value and the value placed on this principle in American society, among the corporate elite, among business schools. And so I want to say a little bit about the relationship between financialization, shareholder value, and the corporate restructuring of the American economy, and in some ways, as a result, the impact on the globalization of capitalism. So let's touch on a few of these points briefly. So this relationship between financialization and shareholder value does have its origin in two theoretical models, observations that were made in the 1960s into the 1970s. And it's important to link an existing political economic dynamic, shareholder value capitalism, if you like, with these theoretical developments. Now, for people who study American business, the American corporation, one thing they observed back in the as early as the 1950s and into the 1960s was what they called the separation of ownership and control. And what that means is that you have professional managers who essentially control the corporation. They make decisions about investment and disinvestment and decisions about production and those sorts of things. So you have this kind of professional managerial class, that is controlling the organization by making decisions, but they don't own the corporation. The corporation is owned by shareholders, and there might be 3 or 4 that have the dominant shareholding power. But the point is, ownership is by shareholders, control is by managers. Now, this raises what's called the agency problem in the large corporations. That is the agency problem. We talk about principals and agents. Okay. So the principals, let's say, are the owners, the shareholders, and the agents, okay, are the managers. Now the question is, how do the principals, and in this case, the people who own the corporation, own the shares in the corporation, know that the principals, that is the managers, are acting in their best interests? Because you've got the separation of ownership and control. Shareholders own the corporation by owning shares, but decisions about what the corporation should be doing, how it should be operating, what its responsibilities are made by managers. Managers presumably trained in business schools. Is there a divergence in interest? And in agency theory, there's an assumption that there could be, and in this case, that there is. That is, that managers are making decisions that are not necessarily in the interest of shareholders. Therefore, need to develop a system that ensures, and this is like the agency problem, right? How do you ensure that the agents are representing your interests? What do you put in place to ensure that the managers are making decisions that are in the interest of shareholders? Now, remember, the shareholders, the owners, have an interest in the stock price increasing. Managers may have a whole range of interests, a whole range of priorities. So in the 1980s, you had this movement toward placing shareholder value at the top of the list of priorities, or as the single obligation and objective of the corporation. Enhance shareholder value. I used to teach in a business school at an institution before I got to the University of North Florida. Of course, they wouldn't let me anywhere near their students today over in the business school because I might contaminate them, which I would make every effort to do. But at the earlier institution, I used to teach a course, organization theory. I taught at the business school. And I would ask the students, I say, what are your, interests? What are your priorities? My number one priority is to enhance shareholder value. They just kept saying this over and over again. It was a mantra. It was like a kind of form of indoctrination. Shareholder value. That's the only thing I should be interested in as a manager. Now, this has very, very significant and devastating effects on the American economy. If you think about it, if you think about the fact that managers' primary or singular objective, mission, goal is to enhance shareholder value, that is the value of the stock of that corporation, the price, the stock price, what kind of decisions are they going to make? Are they going to make decisions that are in the interest of the communities, other stakeholders, workers? Probably not. So you can link a lot of what has happened to the American economy and to income distribution to this emphasis on shareholder value. That's what I want to discuss. Briefly, if I can do anything briefly. Okay, so one of the best writers on this question, if you're interested, is William Lazonick. He's an economist, industrial economist, and he's written many, many papers. If you go to Google Scholar and just type in Lazonick, you'll see lots of papers. He's written on shareholder value. And he points out that there was a time when profits of a corporation were retained and reinvested. And in fact, when we think about why do we allow, the capitalists to retain the majority of the profit rather than distributing it to workers, many people will say, well, we do this because they are in a position to reinvest the money and expand the economy and expand employment and expand production. Well, under shareholder value, as Lazonick observes, you see a shift in managerial objectives from retain and reinvest to downsize and distribute. What does he mean? Downsize and distribute. Downsize means outsourcing all kinds of activities that at one time were performed by the corporation, outsourcing, and let's just say outsourcing and offshoring, okay, and distributing dividends to shareholders. So as I said earlier when I talked about neoliberalism, under neoliberalism, the rise of finance becomes increasingly important. And there is pressure on corporations to restructure themselves, and that is to essentially outsource, shed what might be regarded as unnecessary activities, let somebody else do it. That's the outsourcing. Place those activities where possible, or subcontract them to locations where wages are low, regulations are minimal, unions are non-existent. And this is all part of the shareholder ideology. So when corporations started restructuring during the 1970s, during the neoliberal shift, they were rewarded by Wall Street because they were reducing the hard assets they owned, that they were responsible for. They were outsourcing that and having lots of different suppliers compete for their business. So you had what's called the Nikification, the transformation of the corporate structure. mean and lean. That's what they like to talk about back in the business school. We want the corporation to be mean and lean, only focused on your core competencies. Get rid of all of the extra activities that you're engaged in that aren't absolutely necessary. Let somebody else do it, outsource it, and let people who are interested in handling those compete with each other, which reduces price for your business. So we have a long period of this process. And again, I want you to understand corporation restructures. The stock price goes up. It's positively reinforced managerial behavior, positively reinforced by the financial sector. And if shareholder value and enhancing shareholder value is your main objective, then managers will continue to do these sorts of things. Now, here's one other aspect I want to point out. How do you get managers? How do you ensure, and this is the agency problem, how do you ensure that the managers are actually going to be doing what you want them to do? Yes, you can create this ideology of shareholder value, but is that going to be enough? I mean, maybe in business school, they actually learned that there are other stakeholders that they have responsibilities to other than the shareholders. So here's a key aspect. You provide managers that you hire at your corporation with stock options. Think about that. Stock options. Yes, you've been hired, and here's your salary. And by the way, we're giving you some stock options. What does that mean? You have the opportunity to be compensated with shares of stock. Let's say you hire a manager and you give him 100,000 shares of stock as a form of compensation. The whole point of that is to align the interest of the managers with the interest of the shareholders. Now, when managers make decisions, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about their own stock portfolio, which contains hundreds, thousands of shares of the stock of that corporation. So they will make decisions which are positively reinforced by the financial, by the market, by Wall Street. And those will be decisions which largely are reduce costs across the board. Reduce costs in any way you can. If it means closing a factory, close a factory. If it means laying off workers, lay off workers. If it means outsourcing something to China, outsource it to China. Beginning to see the picture here? So I say down, out, off. None of those things sound very positive. Down, size, out, source, offshore. All of these activities were rewarded by Wall Street, enhanced the value of the stock, reinforced that kind of managerial behavior, and you have this spiral of the American economy. Deindustrialization, unemployment, people leaving manufacturing and finding work in other sectors that are much less rewarding materially and economically. This gives rise to higher levels of income inequality, less social mobility, wage stagnation, all of these things. So, when people try to understand how we got where we are today in the political economic sense, shareholder value plays a very important role. And that's why I wanted to emphasize this. Okay, I think this is the last slide. So this is basically just making the connection between some of the things I've already talked about. Neoliberal corporate restructuring. Right? Remember, the crisis of the 70s, corporations felt that they weren't making sufficient profit. Cut taxes, cut regulations, beat up on unions, slash welfare, and let's restructure the organization in ways that will also maximize profit. Because regulations on the shifting and movement of capital were also eliminated, made it easier for corporations to outsource and offshore. So you have what some theorists have called the Nikification Nike is a classic example, one of the classic examples, there's many now, of a corporation that sells sneakers, sportswear, but owns no factories, none, zero. Every single thing that Nike sells is produced by subcontractors in another country. Nothing, as far as I know, is produced here in the United States. So you've got a company that is factoryless. Wall Street likes this. They don't own factories. They don't have all these obligations, all this property that they own, that they have to manage, that they have to maintain. You've outsourced that to somebody else's problem. And those outsourced, independent contractors are competing with each other for your business. That, any factory wants to be putting together Nike shoes because the market is massive, right? Okay, so if you look down the left side, neoliberal corporate restructuring, you have the Nike-fication of the corporation, the factoryless corporation, a corporation that owns no factories. Now, what do they do with all their profits? Well, in the old days, somebody would say, well, they retain the profits and they reinvest them. They reinvest them in what? They reinvest them in factories, or they reinvest them in upgrading the technology. They don't own any factories. They no longer own any factories. There is no reinvestment. As Lazonic argued was the pattern in the past. Retain profits, reinvest them in production, expansion, maintaining your facility. They don't own any facilities. They design and they market. Everything that happens in between, somebody else takes care of. Wall Street likes that. Mean, lean, profitable. So what are they going to do with their profits if they're not invested in production? They invested in financial instruments. One thing corporations have been doing at alarming rates is taking their profits, often the profits they've been getting from tax cuts, because presumably tax cuts provide capitalists with money that then they reinvest and they hire workers and we all benefit. We don't. Because what do they do with the profits? And you can do a little research on this. Corporate buyback shares. Just type that in. They take their profits and they actually buy shares of their own stock. What does that do? Well, if you're increasing demand for your shares, the price goes up. Totally unproductive. This is the degenerate form of capitalism we currently have in the United States, right? And the arrow from the bottom upward to the right is simply, this is great for the financial sector. It enhances shareholder value. It is rewarded. And we have, somebody talked about the two-party doom loop. We have the financialization shareholder value doom loop. This is where we are. When Elizabeth Warren was running in the Democratic primary, because she is an expert on the financial sector, she spent a lot of time talking about this issue, this problem, and what had to be done to shift corporations from shareholder value to stakeholder value. And I think she was a little naive to believe that you could just convince them that it was for the general interest, the public good. You had to put in place some really tough regulations. And this was why earlier in the semester I showed you some of the headlines. Wall Street, sigh of relief that Kamala Harris was selected rather than Elizabeth Warren, because they know Elizabeth Warren has an agenda, and it's agenda to address this very problem. And corporate America does not want this problem addressed. And I doubt that Biden has any interest in addressing it either, because he's getting massive amounts of campaign contributions from the financial sector, as Obama did, which explains why Obama did not prosecute the criminal banks that produced the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Okay, it all circles back to the current political situation. That's the point of this course. It's not to memorize a bunch of stuff and spit it out in an exam. It's to develop the conceptual framework that allows you to understand what the hell is going on. And at the same time, enriching your intellectual horizons with Bowles and Gintis and Merkel and Lazonic and Erkel and Wright. Thank me later. That's it for now.